Hello guys, Garcia here, and welcome to the horror fan review of Jacob's Ladder from 1990. In my native language, Portuguese, we don't have a simple phrase that I could use to express the impact that this movie had on my brain the first time I saw it more than a decade ago. But the English language happens to have a very good one. This movie hits too close to home. To explain what I mean, I will first go over the movie with you guys, sharing my impressions and interpretations of several specific parts of the film. And then, in the second part of the video, I am going to explain why this movie impacted me in a very peculiar and profound way. So let's start. First of all, we need to talk about Tim Robbins. His performance in this movie was excellent. If the Jacob character had been given to a lesser actor, this film probably would not be considered the classic that it is today. Basically, the entire movie is carried by his performance, and the fact that his character is always conflicted just adds complexity to his task, because Jacob is never dealing with a single emotion. Sometimes he's sad, but also confused. Sometimes he's smiling, but he's also in pain. Sometimes he's scared, but also determined. There's always several layers to consider. That said, let's take a look at the movie. The movie starts with the Vietnam War flashbacks that have been plaguing Jacob's brain for a while now, and they are all violent and brutal, naturally. It was just a dream though, and Jacob wakes up in a train going back to his house after a day's work. So after talking to a strange lady on the train, he sees a tentacle coming out of the clothes of a beggar, and he almost ends up crushed by the train's doors. It's an interesting storytelling choice when you think about it. Usually in psychological horror movies, the story is told using the slow burn approach, slowly revealing the traumas, mysteries, and only using visions and terrifying imagery later on in the movie, after the descent into madness that characters in those stories go through has already started and progressed enough to give them these experiences. But not here. We already know about the war, and he's already seeing supernatural things from the get-go, so we don't start the story from the point of view of a character that is healthy and mentally stable. We jump into the car mid-journey, when his mental condition is already affecting him in the physical world. Right after he leaves, we have this sequence in which he almost gets run over by a train, while simultaneously seeing the otherworldly beings for the first time in the movie. He kind of skips between two different train tracks, trying to decide to where he should move to avoid the collision. So that's the first metaphorical dilemma right here. Do you deal with the train and its passengers head on, or do you dodge it to postpone the emotional tolls and difficult decision making until you feel like you're ready? The monsters on this film are not physical creatures, but rather Jacob's memories, insecurities, regrets, and mistakes, basically being materialized in the reality his conscience is currently living in. It's a matrix of sorts, a prison built by his own mind to force him to deal with his demons before the end. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, so more on this later. When he leaves the elevator of his building, we see him putting a doll back in a stroller on the corridor before entering his apartment. These weird but not necessarily scary places show up several times in the movie, and I assume that the reason they feel slightly off is because their current appearance was designed by Jacob's brain, and them not feeling completely natural is a byproduct of that. When we meet Jezebel, Jacob's girlfriend, and during their interactions we learn a lot about their current situation. Jacob is divorced, and he had 3 sons, but one passed away before he went to Vietnam. Just seeing his picture makes him cry, showing us that he's still emotionally dealing with this to this day. This will be very important later on. Jacob waking up from a nightmare didn't seem to bother Jezebel too much, which is a sign that this type of occurrence is not uncommon for him. He then goes to meet with his chiropractor, I guess, to treat his back, and he seems to be a good friend of his. We learned that Jacob has a PhD, but ended up working at the post office because of the traumas he suffered during the war. The doctor also treats Jacob's ex-wife's niece, and they talk about her for a while during his treatment, about the fact that she still loves him, and that the doctor thinks that her and Jacob should get back together. The doctor, Louis, feels like a physical manifestation of Jacob's hopes and also of his feelings towards his former wife. He still loves her, and he thinks she still feels the same feeling towards him, and a part of him will always feel like they should get back together one day. It doesn't matter if this doctor actually existed before Jacob went to war. What matters is that in this reality, the doctor plays the part of a loving and caring friend to Jacob that understands and supports him. We also have the first jump scare of the movie in this sequence, and it's pretty effective, not only because the editing is very smooth, but also because there's only a few in the film, and they never feel cheap or are the main focus of the experience. The scene ends with Jacob calling the doctor an angel and a lifesaver, further supporting my theory that the doc is a manifestation of the positive part of his mind. He is then chased by a car that has one of those creatures inside of it, and he's warned by a guy that will show up again later on in the movie. By this point, he is starting to lose it, so he decides to go meet with Dr. Carlson, the doctor that has been taking care of him since he came back from Vietnam. The secretary seems to be one of the creatures, so he decides to look for the doctor himself and finds out that he died because of an explosion. My opinion is that he's dead in this reality because Jacob's mind was unable to create a version of him, possibly because he needed the advice and solutions that Carlson would provide, so Jacob just wasn't able to mentally manifestate a mirror image of a doctor that had answers that Jacob himself didn't. Jezebel and Jacob have an open conversation about his visions, and later on they go to a party. Jacob has a palm reading session with a random lady there, and she says that according to his lifeline, he is already dead. During the movie, Jacob himself and others openly talk about the possibility of him being dead, and maybe that bothered some people that watched the movie over the years. But I felt like in this particular movie, it was actually a good choice. Him questioning his own existence and having said existence being confirmed by others around him can be seen as his mind attempting to convince itself that it still lives. The other characters in this scenario feeling almost like a self-defense mechanism for Jacob's own psyche. So he ends up having some sort of psychotic episode or a seizure alongside some borderline Lovecraftian visions involving Jezebel and tentacles. They go back home, and Jacob's fever is so bad that Jezebel and the neighbors end up throwing him into the bathtub with ice to cool him off. He then wakes up alongside Sarah, his former wife, in a time when they were still married and his son was still alive. These time jumps can absolutely be confusing, and a lot of people hate movies that use this device to tell their story. But after finishing the movie, it's easy to understand what went down. Basically, during the movie, Jacob is constantly switching between his past self, his present self, and his future self, because almost everything that happens in the story takes place in his own mind. Memories, expectations, and regrets are always blending with each other, and the disorientation that the audience feels ends up mimicking Jacob's mental state. So we end up being able to relate better to his confusion and despair because we are essentially feeling the same. After the vision about his past, we see a glimpse of the present in which the other soldiers are trying to bring him to a doctor, but there's almost no chance of him surviving the trip. Tim's acting here in the bathtub is amazing. One thing is to have some makeup in your face to help you convey some type of emotion. Another thing completely is to actually make you believe that said emotion is really being felt, and I was convinced. He wakes up in his bed the following day, and Jezebel is taking care of him. Then he asks her, Am I home? This question right here is the most important one in the movie. He is not asking her if he is in his house. He's actually asking her, am I where I'm supposed to be? Is this the place where I belong? Is this my reality? And those questions are connected to his next question. Am I dead? She answers, no, you're right here. But he's apparently not convinced. 2 weeks go by, and now Jacob is in full-on research mode, trying to figure out why the demons are after him, and he ends up seeing one inside Jezebel. That is a good, albeit exaggerated representation of what mental health issues can do to relationships. So he's so detached from his current reality that he isn't who he was anymore, and Jezebel changed her behavior accordingly, basically being forced into becoming a worse version of herself to adapt to him. Most relationships never recover from this cycle, but that's not the point of this particular story, so moving on. Jacob receives a call from a former army colleague named Paul, who's also experiencing the demonic visions and he just can't handle them anymore. During their conversation, the dude with the glasses that showed up earlier in the movie returns and eavesdropped the conversation. They go outside and Paul's car explodes, killing him instantly, but Jacob is saved by the glasses man. We again see a vision of the present in which one of the pilots of the rescue helicopter is killed, and we can maybe assume that this pilot was the real Paul. Jacob meets the other survivors of his old platoon during Paul's funeral, and they apparently are also seeing the strange creatures, and they wonder if the army did something to them. They decide to try to hire Dr. Geary, a lawyer, to investigate the army and maybe find some answers. But the lawyer decides to not take their case because he claims to have seen documents that prove that they never went to Vietnam because they were discharged before the war. Jacob's former companions also backed down from the investigation, probably because they were threatened by the government and army officials. Jacob is captured by some agents and is threatened by them, but he's able to escape. He gets hurt pretty badly though, so an ambulance is called and he is taken to a hospital. So we finally reached the point in the movie where one of the most legendary horror sequences of all time takes place. Most people remember this movie specifically because of this part, despite it actually being pretty short. It is said that this sequence alone inspired many other works in all kinds of media, including the Silent Hill games. The nurses take Jacob to what looks like an abandoned building, then they traverse what seems to be a madhouse, and finally, they end up in a slaughterhouse of some sort, with its floors full of human remains. The doctors strap up Jacob to the stretcher, and they are going to either perform an operation on him, or torture him, or maybe both. This scene right here is the main reason why many people theorize that Jacob is in hell, being tortured eternally for some reason. Jezebel is there, and he pleads with her, saying that he just wants to go home, but one of the doctors answers his questions first, and he says to him that he is already home because he's dead. Now, to me, this part feels way more like Jacob's brain trying to adjust itself to the fact that he is dying than some infernal punishment. The whole bit with the doctors and the madhouse seem more like his brain processing his final fears and regrets, a mix of self-loathing and a desire to be punished, as if, in his final moments, Jacob not only accepted the fact that he's dying, he concluded that he actually deserves this fate. That's why Jezebel was there. It's a sign that his brain recognized that him thinking about a future after the war with somebody else was foolish and arrogant, because he's just one more that's about to die on the battlefield. Just a number, like everybody else. After another small glimpse of the present, in which a soldier says we're losing him, we return to the future timeline. Sarah and the kids come to visit Jacob in the hospital, and she confesses to him that she still loves him, That's basically his present brain, materializing what he felt could happen in the future given their relationship. My second favorite scene in the movie is this one, because right after she tells him that she still loves him, his more realistic and cynical side tells future Jacob to dream on, as if to say that this future will never happen, either because his present self is almost dead, or because the version of his ex-wife that his future self created doesn't correspond to the real one. It's absolutely brutal. That is basically him accepting the fact that there's no future anymore, even to his own hopes and dreams. Later on, Dr. Louis invades Jacob's room in the hospital and takes him away to his consultation room. They have a very interesting conversation about a fellow called Meister Eckhart. I don't know who that is, but Louis says to Jacob that this theologist saw hell just like he's seen, and that he said that only your attachments to your former life burn in hell, like your memories, and after that your soul has been cleansed and you are free. It's not a punishment, it's a purification process. Remember when I said Dr. Louis was a materialization of the positivity in Jacob's mind? Here he is again, trying to rationalize and justify the suffering that Jacob is going through in his final moments, basically saying to him, don't worry, even if you are in hell, or even if you end up in hell, it's not going to be that bad, and you will be free afterwards. They also talk about letting go. Louis advises him to just let go of his earthly connections, to accept the fact that his time is done, and that once that happens, the devils that have been destroying his life will basically become angels, the ones that are responsible for freeing his soul and setting him free. Don't be afraid, because your cycle will eventually end, but you will be free afterwards. That's why future Jacob has a back problem. He is carrying all these fears, regrets, memories, and connections, and his chiropractor, which is basically his conscience, is the one that helps him accept his death by relieving him of his metaphorical burdens. It's surprisingly deep and powerful, especially for a horror movie. After the conversation with Louis, Jacob goes home and opens his memory box. I will actually skip this scene for now. I'll talk about this one at the end of the video. Jezebel comes back, the phone rings, and it's Glassman calling. Jacob goes to meet him, and he introduces himself as Michael Newman, a chemist who worked for the US Army. Long story short, they created a super combat performance enhancing drug called the Ladder, and after testing it on some prisoners, they decided to choose a battalion from the American Army to be the guinea pigs in the next experiment. It went horribly wrong because the drug turns men into violent monsters, so eventually the men in Jacob's battalion started to attack each other because of the hyper-aggression. After that, Jacob takes a cab and asks the driver to take him home. We then finally see who wounded Jacob, and it was a drugged American soldier, friendly fire, essentially. He arrives home, in a place in which he probably felt the most satisfied with life, Sarah's house, where his two kids reside. He enters the apartment, walks around for a bit, looks at some old pictures, probably remembering the good old days one final time, and then sits on the couch. And one last time, he relives his fondest memories. The darkened room is now bright and colorful, the weight has been lifted, and Jacob finally fully accepted his fate. Then he sees Gabe, the son he lost years ago, and together they climb the stairs towards Jacob's real home. Not Jezebel's house, not Sarah's house, nor the battlefield, but alongside his son, in death. The final scene of the movie shows us the actual death of the real Jacob Singer, who, as it turned out, was able to accept his fate and make peace with his own soul. This movie is not about monsters, eternal punishment, or war. It's about letting go and accepting the fact that one day we will have to go through the same process. If we're lucky, that is. It's been a while, but in the beginning of the video, I said I was going to explain why this movie impacted me so much when I first saw it, and I'm going to use the scene that I skipped during the review to do so. Jacob opens his memory box, and inside it are all kinds of memories. Good, bad, terrible, great. Some conflict with future Jacob, others would be shameful to past Jacob, and others relate to present Jacob. But there's one constant, one memory that he cherishes above all and dreads above all at the same time. Gabe, his deceased son. That's why he opened the box now, after his conversation with Louis. He felt like he could overcome all of his daughter demons, but before he leaves this planet, he needs to come to terms with the passing of his son and the regret he feels for not being able to save him. I've been clinically depressed since I was 10 years old. I also have OCD and insomnia. Suffice to say, it is not a good combination of problems to have. I already opened my memory box many years ago, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I walked halfway the final bridge several times, and that means that I know that I do not have the luxury of postponing my conflicts. They have to be decided daily, so if I go, my peace has already been made. And not just for me. Terminal patients, war veterans, victims of extreme abuse, those who are imprisoned in their own bodies and minds, and many others need to deal with that box daily, because tomorrow might not come for us. That's why this movie destroyed me when I first saw it, because Jacob was able to let go and free himself before he went. Will I be able to do the same? Or will I go feeling like a prisoner until my last second? Could you accept such fate? Jacob's Ladder is indeed a horror movie, but is actually a hopeful one. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next one.